I'm Wally Mason. I'm the director of the museum. I am so happy you're here tonight. But quite frankly, I'm happier that Hank Willis Thomas is here. It is just a delight to have him here. And I think that it's worth mentioning the fact that if you haven't seen the Black Fire exhibition, I'd argue you've missed something. But more importantly, the museum has, over the last 6 to 8 months, made a few what I would consider, and I think most would consider, major acquisitions. We acquired a Willie Birch, a Robert Colescott, Leonardo Drew, and more importantly, our speaker tonight, a work by Hank Willis Thomas. And you know, the entire history of a museum is based on its collection. So, as I said to Hank tonight, you're now part of the family. So, we have a family member with us tonight. I'm thrilled to introduce Hank Willis Thomas.
It's great to be here. Thank you for that wonderful and perfect introduction. I prefer to be treated and introduced as I am, which is a family member. And I think of that in all ways. Can we turn this light down a little bit? Sorry. Actually, when I start a talk sometimes, as of late, I've been inspired by a 5-channel video installation I did last year called "A Person is More Important Than Anything Else," and it's based off of accumulation of archival footage that I found of James Baldwin, much of it from this wonderful documentary that Karen Thorson did called The Price of the Ticket. And so I wanted to start off just actually with this clip. Could we turn the lights all the way down? Yeah.
It seems to me that the artist's struggle for his integrity must be considered as a metaphor for the struggle which is universal and daily of all human beings on the face of this terrifying globe to get to become human beings. What we might get at this evening, if we are lucky, if the mic doesn't fail, my voice holds out, if you ask me questions, is what the importance of this effort is.
Now, when you were starting out as a writer, you were a black, impoverished homosexual. You must have said to yourself, gee, how disadvantaged can I get?
Oh, no, I thought I hit the jackpot.
Oh, great.
It was so outrageous you could not go any further, you know. It had to be, so you had to find a way to use it.
James Baldwin, who are you?
First of all, I'm speaking as an American citizen. I'm speaking also as the grandson of a slave.
My mother was born in Maryland, my father was born in New Orleans, I was born in New York.
Someone who represents a very complex country which insists on being simple-minded.
This piece, which is actually goes on for another half hour, actually, is to me really profound, particularly because it features a person who died almost 20 years ago and really started their career almost 60 years ago, but speaking about issues that I think are equally relevant today. And how often can we really say that? You know, think about people who were dealing with issues of ostracization, whether it be through poverty or through racism or through homophobia. I mean, that's really profound, and someone who not only did that, but had a national presence. I think so often we forget the power and the value of using your voice to speak from your unique and hopefully complicated perspective to any number of issues all at once. But this idea of us being from a very complex country, and then that insists on being simple-minded, is something that is resonant, I think, in our daily lives, especially when we look at the political landscape, but also when we look at just our social landscape and the way in which we categorize ourselves and categorize each other through these kind of binary systems like black and white, when most of the people in the world aren't black and white, they're actually Asian, and they range in skin complexion from the darkest of us to the very lightest of us. But then again, none of us are actually black. My skin is brown, and I'm constantly perplexed by the very simplistic ways in which we talk about our own identities and the way that we insist on continuing to categorize ourselves and others based off of kind of outdated and hyperbolic kind of identity constructions. But anyway, I say that, and partially because like around the same time that Baldwin was having a lot of his kind of revelations, this image was produced in the Negro Digest, and I appropriated it for a piece a while ago. But it really spoke to this really profound moment in my life, which was the day I noticed that I was supposed to be a certain way that kind of was not fully a member of our society. I feel like everyone has that experience the day we were othered. Does everyone have an experience where they realized they were not like everyone else? Who has had that type of experience? Raise your hand. Who has not had that type of experience? Not everyone rose their hand the first time, but then, okay. Well, I'm really interested in the moment that we realized that we were othered, whether we were too tall, too short, too fat, too thin, too dark, too light, that we spoke another language, we had another accent. The moment that we felt different. And so I will ask you guys to take, is everyone close to someone? Damien, can you come to the gentleman who's right next to you? And sir, who's with the camera, I can't remember your name. Can you talk to the other guy with the camera right there? Can you turn the lights up, Ty? Can we just take first 1 minute on each side for each of you guys to talk about that moment where you realized that you were other? You guys ready? Go. It's strange for me as an artist to be up in front of people talking about myself when I'm frankly more interested in each of you. And because each of you is a part of me. And there was a quote recently that I came across from Maya Angelou where she says, "I am a human, therefore nothing human can be alien from me." And I think that's something that we try to remember but so often forget. We all have more things in common than we have that separate us. And so in the moments where we feel separated from someone, how do we bridge that gap? And how do we open ourselves up and become vulnerable? That, for me, the idea of where I belong in society, a lot of it was shaped from my own experience with my mother, whose name is Bert Williams, who's a photographer and photo historian who introduced me to Gordon Parks as in live flesh when I was 5 or 6 years old. And I knew that there was something different even about him at that age. But my mother's whole story is that she is a photo historian, and she realized that the way in which African Americans were being documented by mainstream society was different than the way African Americans had been documenting themselves. And she wrote a book called Black Photographers, 1840 to 1940, a biobibliography, which spoke to the idea that black people were making images as early as 1840, which is near the beginning of photography. And so to think that black people 2 decades before the end of slavery officially in our country were part of the cutting edge of science, art, and technology really complicates our own notions of what the quote-unquote black experience was. And so, and she then wrote like 30 other books, and mostly around photography. And I so very much see myself in following in her footsteps, often because I go places and people are like, "Your mom was just here." But also I look a lot like her. And so we did this piece called Sometimes I See Myself in You, which is really about that kind of reflective relationship we have, where we're both thinking about media and images and how it is a landscape. It's a visual landscape where there is a battle kind of always taking place about who belongs where and who can say what and what means. And so I look at images in my own work of media images, especially media images that seem to be making suggestions or complicating notions or bringing up new issues or old issues around who belongs where and what's okay or what things kind of need to be, recreated. But also images that have roots that we often forget about. Images like this, where that have a very direct connection to images like this. How many people know who this is? Anybody? Nobody knows. So this person was arguably the most well-known African American of his generation, just about 100 years ago, actually. What do you think this person did for a living? Writer? Why are you guys mumbling? What's that? Politician? Professor? Anybody else? Lawyer? Well, this is how he presented himself when he went about his daily life, and this is how he presented himself in the professional world. His name was Bert Williams, and I find it so striking about the way that he performed his authentic blackness off stage and the way that he was celebrated and made wealthy for his authentic presentation of blackness on stage, and how so many opportunities for so many people came through his willingness to perform things in this way, but also some of the problematics of how certain ideas got kind of fixed in our psychology about who belongs where in society, and then, which also happened somewhere around this time. But then somewhere around this time, there was this dramatic flip of the switch of like who belonged where, especially in these specific rings of domination that I think we'll be seeing new conversations be evoked soon. But I'm really interested in how the images that are created in the media and about the media affect the way that we see the world. So in my own work, I look at images, and I especially been looking at logos as hieroglyphs and thinking about them being these things that are embedded with meaning. But then how could that meaning be kind of subverted? How could I talk about other things that advertising couldn't responsibly talk about? I think about how slaves were branded as a sign of ownership, and now so many of us brand ourselves willingly, and thinking about how advertising is the most ubiquitous language in the world, but it's often used just to talk about selling products. But how about talking about the actual, I think the original, I wouldn't say the original sin, but the original ad. I think race is the most successful advertising campaign of all time. The fact that you think of Africa, which is a huge continent with hundreds of millions of people, with thousands of languages and worldviews and cultures, and in the interest of commerce, Europeans needed to create a subhuman brand of people who could be turned into chattel to property. And so you package these people, millions of people from diverse places, and package them into ships, send them halfway across the world, and telling them they're all the same. Then 500 years later, they're still seen through the lens of this box. To me, that's absolute power. I'm really interested in how branding affects our minds, how it affects my mind, how I live in an age, in a stage of branded consciousness, and how I think many of us, at least in previous generations, didn't have a direct corporate relationship to the way that we saw ourselves. And thinking about the society of the spectacle and how certain bodies might have been treated at one period of time, and how they kind of function in a different way in our moment, or in places like this where they're, here, like here, where there is this amazing, I think, problematic hypocrisy of there being a multi-billion-dollar industry that many of us, including me tonight, profit from, that's fueled largely off of the free labor of descendants of slaves. It's amazing to me that we continue to do that, and that we don't necessarily want to recognize the correlation. And so in my work, I'm frequently trying to bring up the issues that are complicated about like who belongs where, what are the limitations of our own success or our own notions of who we can be. But also, how can I talk about things that are really important to me in my own life, that I feel not only ambivalent, but I feel very frustrated about, but not sure how to address them. For instance, being in the funeral home after my cousin was murdered in Philadelphia, and with who was my best friend, and with my family, and there's even in I don't know how many people have had a funeral for a young person. Raise your hand. So that's a lot of people in this room. And for me, one of the things that was shocking, and I was even younger than, I was 23 or so at the time, that we were in the funeral home, and there's this kind of unspoken thing that you have to, like there's a $7,000 casket and a $5,000 casket and a $2,000 casket. And there's an unspoken thing that, like, you love them more if you buy the $7,000 box of wood that's going to be thrown in the dirt, never to be seen again, and that maybe you couldn't afford to love them enough if you buy the $2,000 box of wood that's going to be thrown in the dirt, never to be seen again. And that, so that even in mourning, that we're still being marketed to and trying to market the value of someone's life, which can never truly be quantified. And so I find it fascinating that the language of advertising, which is so powerful to communicate ideas, is so rarely used to talk about the other issues. And so I've been appropriating that in my work, and so I put it in museums and galleries, but also put it on outside of museums like the Yerba Buena Center for the Art, and then I brought it to the Birmingham Museum of Art, and there was a response that was unexpected.
Melanie takes a look at it. She joins us live from the museum tonight. Melanie?
Well, Janet and Devin, here is the picture that we're talking about. You can see the MasterCard logo and you see the MasterCard slogan, so you think it's a MasterCard ad, right? Wrong. What it is doing is creating a lot of dialogue, and those here at the museum say that is exactly what it was designed to do. The picture hangs boldly on the back of the Birmingham Museum of Art, an African-American family grieving at a funeral. The caption, a spinoff of the MasterCard advertising campaign. Three-piece suit, $250. Gold chain, $400. 9mm pistol, $79. Bullet, 60 cents. Picking the perfect casket for your son, priceless. To the unknowing eye, it brings a strong response.
Yeah, that's offensive to me too, because it seems like it's stereotypical that people are just tagging the black community with the things that we use, the things that we buy, things that we flaunt.
And I'm not black, but I would think that it would be offensive to black people.
I think when someone walks off the street, they're wondering, is it an ad? If not, why is it up here? What is it? What's the point? Why does MasterCard have their name on it?
This is not an ad. It's contemporary art on display at the Birmingham Museum of Art. The artist, a young black man by the name of Hank Willis Thomas. The picture taken at his own cousin's funeral after he was killed during a robbery.
He wanted to get at the grief his family was feeling and the frustration with this sort of cycle of violence that's sort of afflicting the country. I think he's using the term priceless here, not in a satiric way, but to suggest that life is the most priceless thing of all.
Willis relies on artistic license to play off of the MasterCard logo, a key he uses knowing how much Americans connect with advertising. After learning what it's all about, Jennifer Swenson's response turns from offense to grief and eventually hope.
I guess the artist had a choice. He could have picked up a gun and he could have sought revenge. And what this artist chose to do was to make a statement, even though it's offensive to some people, if it changed one person's thought process in life, then it would be worth it.
Now, because of the response to this picture, the museum has put up this explanation. However, as you can see, it is rather small in comparison to the picture. Some people may miss it, so they plan to add a much larger placard later. Also, the curator says the reason this piece is outside is because it was too large to fit inside the...
Should I have gotten a gun and killed somebody, or should I have made art? I mean, to me, I made art. Just to be clear, I think that was the right decision. And this is a work that's hanging currently in the museum and is now part of the permanent collection. I felt it was important to show the ways in which a work can function, whereas I wanted to make a work of art really to talk about the issues related to my cousin, but when I put it out in the public, there were the last thing I ever would have thought that it would have been seen as something that was offensive to the African American community, which was a really important lesson because it made me have to talk about and think about why I wanted to make that work. But also, I think often when you make work that's political in nature, you hope that there will be some kind of large public response, but you never really think that it's going to be on Fox News and then kind of dissected in this way. And so for me, this piece, which is says everything about what happens when a work of art is kind of put into a public discourse. There's this question of like people who are brown see other brown people in public images as having to be a reflection of them, even if they don't know the people in the image, they don't know the context of the image, and therefore they feel stereotyped. But then other people say things, I mean, I just can go on, but I'll try to sum it up as like, that's crazy. that the woman's like, well, because it says a lot about who has the right to say what. Like it's not an ad, it's art, therefore it's meant to be provocative, and it's made by a young black man, so it couldn't be racist. And it was a photograph taken at his own cousin's funeral, so it couldn't be insensitive. And then that moment when the woman says, you know, like, I'm not black, but I can see how it's offensive to black people. So it's like the other team, you know, that's, you know, it's like calling a foul for the other team. And that's where I start to realize, like, how crazy is it that we have these ideas made up in our mind about kind of all of these kind of the psychological jujitsu that we play with one another to really come to a position of where we stand and how we feel about things that we engage in. And I think about that often because when I look at the images that are produced in the media, I do sometimes find myself affected and wonder about why and what I could do about it. And part of the reason I wanted you all to have that discussion in the beginning was because I want you to think about kind of where you started to see yourself and how frequently those moments where we thought we were other define the rest of our lives or things that we're struggling with the rest of our lives. And so for me, I was labeled black and male in America, although my skin is brown. And I always have struggled with notions of what black male identity is. And especially when I come across images like this, images which, this is an ad that I saw all over New York City, and I saw it around a group of young teenagers, and I was kind of curious because I wondered how images like that affected the way that they build their own social constructions, how they relate to one another. How many people know what this is an ad for? For shoes, for what else? Reebok? But how can you tell? What are you pointing at? The logo. So we are at the moment where we don't even need to see a word. We can see 3 letters, RBK, and a sign, and we don't even need to see shoes. We don't actually need to see the product because even the person wearing the shirt is wearing a different logo on his shirt. And who is this person? 50 Cent. Who is 50 Cent? A rapper? G-Unit. But apparently, who is he according to this? A criminal. Like, I am what I am. And I saw this and I was like, okay, this is an amazing moment where we now see a musician selling what we can interpret as shoes through wearing his own clothes and saying that he's a criminal. Like, this is an amazing moment. And why is that something to, how has that become something marketable even in our society? That's kind of amazing, right? And I thought maybe I'm like reading too much into it, maybe I'm being too sensitive, so I went online and I went to see what other images were being produced at the same time. And this was another one featuring Andy Ruddock, who's a tennis player, champion, and then Lucy Liu, who's like a little girl, and then Yao Ming, is a monkey on a basketball. And Allen Iverson was the devil. And then Jay-Z says, I got my MBA from Marcy Projects. And so I guess, and he's got the rubber bands, which I guess are supposed to signify that he's a drug dealer. And I found this was like amazing that these were like, I guess, celebrated public images, because first of all, in selling these products, African American men are like 5% of the population. But in this first kind of release of this campaign, they're represented 3 times, none of whom are represented particularly positively. So you have the one guy who says, I'm a criminal. And then you have the one quote unquote white guy who says, I'm a champion, although I feel bad about it, which is the white man's burden. And then you have more than half of the population, meaning women, represented like it only once in this campaign originally, and the one person is Asian American, who's supposed to kind of be like, she's black but not black, white not white, and even still there's like, when you think about who she is, she's basically essentially this kind of docile, innocent, almost mindless little being. And then you have the Chinese giant, which something we clearly don't know what to do with, and then and every orientalizing stereotype mashed up into one. And then the other black guy's the devil, and the other one's a drug dealer. This is how we sell shoes. Like, and I couldn't figure out like how I could beat that or complicate that in my own work. And so I started to look at other ads, and I started, and someone gave me this one. They were like, you should do something with this. And I couldn't figure out what to do with it. And all I could think of doing with it after looking at it for 4 years was this. And I realized that the last thing that you'd think this is an ad for is Japanese cars, right? And I started to really recognize that most ads, when you look at them, have nothing actually to do with the product as much as what myths or generalizations we can attach to the product through actually the training of media literacy. And that the brands over time have conditioned us to see certain bodies as signifiers and tell certain stories subconsciously. So this is an ad I found from 1969. What do you guys think this is an ad for? Pants on fire. It says, Slack Power, the anti-establishment post-grad slacks by his. Our post-grad slacks have soul and and they come in a mighty medley of plaids, stripes, and checks, and solids. And I found this astounding that, because most of the ads that were being made then and now were made by white men on Madison Avenue, and that as early as 1969, they had figured out how to appropriate the language and the mentality of the Black Power movement to sell what looked like golf pants to me, to the educated revolutionary. And so I started this project called Unbranded Reflections in Black by Corporate America from 1968 to 2008, and I would remove all the advertising information and look at what's really being sold. And so this is yet another one featuring Joe Frazier, heavyweight boxing champion. What do you guys think this is an ad for? Syrup, margarine. Somebody said margarine. It is actually an ad for margarine. It's Blue Bonnet. But most of us, we immediately go back to this characterization of a slave mammy and thinking about Aunt Jemima. And I find that also fascinating, the kind of this hidden messages in images. And I often think about what is it that we're actually buying into when we buy products based off of the advertisement. Like, what other things are we buying with the things? And so this one is actually an ad I found in Ebony magazine in 2005. And what I also find fascinating about looking at real ads is that ads are really a reflection of a society's hopes and dreams at a given moment in time. And they are, in a sense, no single person can be held accountable. It's all kind of us. And they speak to the zeitgeist in a way. And so what do you guys think this is an ad for, and why was it in Ebony? Anybody? I know. It's an ad for kitty litter. And you might ask yourself, how did it find itself in Ebony magazine? And I came up with my own hypothesis that there's that stereotype that black people like watermelon. And they're like, so how do we get black people to buy our kitty litter? And like, well, what would be more civilized if all the seeds were in one place and you can just scoop them away, just like our kitty litter? Like, that's really like the only logic that makes sense, kind of like the one with the gold teeth. Like, black people like gold teeth. If we made our car a gold tooth. There is this kind of way in which these ideas get fixed in our minds over time. And also, and as you find moments of change, like images like this from 1977 for Manwich, which is an ad that literally couldn't have existed in 1967, where you have a black man and a white man sitting at the same lunch counter. So that's a major subtle suggestion, but the white man's looking longingly at his dark meat, which is also a product of popular culture and blaxploitation and images that kind of the society got embraced as the new thing that's okay. And so I'm also interested in these things that kind of happen in the different images, or subtle suggestions of like the best way to smoke a cigarette is in front of a fan so the smoke blows right back into your face. And so with this project, I took 2 ads for every year from 1968 to 2008 and removed all the advertising information. And I wanted to really look at what's really being sold. And sometimes the images are much more subtle, like this one, where the people in this ad just happen to be black, quote unquote, where race isn't so much a factor, but gender roles fall into play. And no one in this room has to even guess what this is an ad for, because we figured it out as soon as we saw it, which is also curious. But you see the men play as the women watch. And then you see the woman on the left feeding this guy a burger, where you look at his right hand, he's got his own burger down there. And so you can almost imagine the photographer being there like, oh, you need something to do, feed him. There are these, so even as kind of there may be progress in one area, there's certain things that stay the same. And certain things that change, like certain images like this one, which are, I think, is really about this place, actually. In a way. What would you guys think this is an ad for? For Chevy, the heartbeat of America. And there is this, this is for Black History Month, to be clear, obviously. You could tell. And it said, once upon a time in America, there were people who were proud and strong, and all of these things about like the people that are celebrating. And I looked at it, and there's this timeline. You see the African chief griot and the soldier, and the jazz musician and civil rights activist and the college graduate. And I was looking, I was like, this is really nice. I was like, what a great tribute to African-American history. Then I was like, wait a minute, something's missing in this timeline of black history, because you couldn't sell the heartbeat of America with a picture of a beat-up bloody slave in the middle of it. And so even in the celebration of kind of these people, so to speak, that the major element of their history is erased. And that's what that's why we're buying our cars. As a joke, but it's also kind of true. Like, that's what we're buying into. This idea that our history is this unifying, empowering story, rather than this really complicated story that needs to be acknowledged and worked through in every moment in order for us to maintain our humanity. And so in this, I exhibited the whole series at the Rubel Family Collection in Miami in 2008. And that was, I didn't realize when I started the series that would be a monumental year with the election of the first multi-ethnic president of the United States. And also that a lot of the conversation was about, like, if you were voting, I guess, from a Democratic perspective, are you more racist or are you more sexist? Maybe from a Republican perspective, are you more ageist or more racist? They're these kind of, again, binary notions. And I started thinking about more recently what was happening in the United States just 100 years ago now, and wanted to look at kind of how African Americans were represented in images then. But then I started thinking about 100 years ago in the country, black men technically had the right to vote, even though everything was done to make sure they didn't. But no women in our society really were empowered to vote. And so looking at images like this one from 1915, the same year that Birth of a Nation came out, there is this other story that's happening below the surface in this image, whereas he may be the servant, but technically he might be more empowered. And I wanted to I was interested in this idea of how kind of racial and gender politics kind of come to head around the same time. And I started looking at what images were being produced, thinking about women's suffrage and how what images were being produced talking about that moment. At which in a lot of those images start to remind me of the images that were being produced of African Americans as they were trying to fight for equality in our society. And it struck me about how a lot of the physical violence that was taking place against African Americans was being acted out psychologically against quote unquote white women who wanted to have a voice, because there was this fear that it happens even today, that every time other people become more equal to us, we're going to have to lose something. And I was astounded by the level of hyperbole. I mean, maybe this did come true. I don't know. You guys can talk about your own experiences. But this was the real visceral response and the advertising campaign that was designed to disempower women. And I was curious about this as being also about primarily white women. And so I started this project that I did this year called Unbranded, A Century of White Women, where I wanted to really track the creation of a quote-unquote white female demographic in advertising and look at I don't know what whiteness is, but I know that my identity is defined by it in a sense. And especially thinking that most people, 100 years ago, most people we consider white today would not be white, like Italians and Russians and Irish and Germans and Spanish people and Polish people, white people. Most of them would not be considered white. And how did whiteness, which a lot of these immigrants came around that time, how did whiteness take shape, but also how did white femaleness take shape through that? And so the series goes to 100 years, and I'm just showing you a few. It's, to me, fascinating, just because you can actually see the psychological manipulation, like images like this one, which are right after World War II, where you see this woman kind of in the office, and a lot of things that happen as women were asking for more opportunity in society were these kind of images that are either violent or embarrassing, like this one from 1952, where she says, "I dreamt I won the election in my maiden-form bra," or images that strike me as fascinating, like this one, which is celebrating African beauty. Right? Where's Egypt? Where? Okay, wait, say a little bit louder. Doesn't it make anybody crazy that most representations of Africans are done by Anglo-Saxons? Like in the movie Exodus? And even in images like this one, it's just very, very clear that if you look at the sarcophagus on the right, top right, you see the complexion of the person there, or you look at the hand coming out, it's a totally different complexion. And there is literally this denial about the people who live along the Nile, who range in complexion from, as most of us always do, but they definitely were not Anglo-Saxon. And so there's this, yet again, erasure of black history and its celebration of it in these advertisements, which also belie other kind of betrayals, I should say, of the status quo of white female purity or virtue. And the same year that Emmett Till was killed for whistling at a white woman, allegedly, this ad was out, which was an ad to celebrate, to sell corsets. That she's gladly dragged by this person by her hair so she can come into modernity, but at the same time, a teenager is murdered for finding her attractive. These are the images that I think say so much about our society that can't be read in a book. Images like this one say it all, which is from 1960, and you see these two men on the precipice with this woman who's kind of on the precipice of losing her life, and she's kind of at their whim, and they're deciding whether or not they should either pull her up or let her down, or let her go, which is really what the discourse was about, giving women equal opportunity in the workplace, which is still actually a conversation that's going on. But then it was just more blunt. Men are better than women. Indoors, women are useful, even pleasant, but on a mountain, they're somewhat of a drag, so don't go hauling them up the side of a mountain to show off your Drummond sweaters. Like, this was not controversial. This is the psychology that formed most of our own notions of who belongs where. And the questions are also who is not represented in these images, or who is implied to be represented as the other in images like this. But the violence against these women is really kind of overt and obvious through that time in the 60s, and it kind of gets out of control until you start to see more and more women in the boardroom and new conversations emerge in different ways. And so I'm really fascinated by that, and then how even new kind of voices and new stories kind of come up as time goes on in that project. But I really wanted to share that with you. I mean, to me, think about what you're looking at. And this all about, to me, all things being equal, finding the reality of that within each of us there is a hybrid, and their lines are somewhat blurry, and that you can't necessarily see anything or anyone by looking at it from one perspective. And so I've been doing that in works like this called Crossroads, where when you look at it from the front, it's blurry, but then from the side, it's clear. So the viewer has to move around to really see it. Or thinking also about where African Americans come from, which I'm often asked, so Africa America, naturally. I call this piece a place to call home. Or works like this one where you, again, it says it could have been me, it should have been you. I'm really interested in how the viewer's unique perspective affects their understanding of the truth and reality. So that's, and thinking about history, I go back to images like this one from Memphis in 1968, where I was struck by the phrase, I am a man, because the phrase I grew up with wasn't I am a man, it was I am the man. And so I remixed that in any number of ways, but I like to read the last line as a poem where it says, I'm the man, who's the man, you the man, what a man. I'm man, I'm human, I'm many. I am I am a man. Because I realized that rather than validating myself on anyone else's standard, that maybe the greatest gift I know the greatest gift that I was given, and that each of us is given, is our consciousness. And really trying to reflect upon that as we walk through the galleries and think about what a person can do, as whether it be simple gestures that we saw a lot in the modernist galleries, or really complex and minimalist galleries, and the really complex gestures that we see that artists are making in some of the other shows that are happening. So in my own work, I'm constantly trying to find new ways to talk about I am, and thinking about Jesse Jackson, thinking about kitsch, thinking about the greatest. Who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? Is that, to me, is that the most amazing kind of message that someone could say, someone from the segregated South, of little means, could tell us in their early 20s that they are the greatest. And 50, 60 years later, they are still, in our minds, the greatest. And he didn't say, I'm the greatest boxer. I'm the greatest of all time. And the audacity of that statement is what I wanted to replicate in the sculpture, which is based off of it's a pinback button, is the audacity of and the absurdity of one's willingness to say I am, and how that can translate. So these sculptures are actually pins that work. And I've been using political pins often, and pinback buttons, which are often seen as kitsch, and putting them now in art context so that we can look at them and ponder them and relate to them in a much more complicated way. I like to look at the archive as an inspiration, because there's so much that we can learn about ourselves and about society within them. And so I've been looking at historical photographs of protest and trying to figure out what it's like to be there. And we've seen a lot of that today. But how do we kind of, for the future generations, build a more closer relationship to that? So I've been making sculptures based off images like this one in apartheid South Africa, and excising moments that I want to bring myself closer to, and think about why this person felt the need and the courage to put their arm through a door, a breathing hole, to send a message to their comrades, and the surrealness of that moment. And so as a photographer, I've been more and more trying to think about the three-dimensional moment and sculptures that kind of invite us to have a more physiological and phenomenological relationship to historical moments, like miners being strip searched in apartheid South Africa. And I felt always guilty looking at this image, because I was always gawking at their butts. But I felt important to represent and to show. And so when I remade it as a sculpture, I cropped it like this, not knowing that just 6 months later, this sculpture would be given a new meaning, even though I titled it Raise Up. So I gave it new meaning in my mind, but then when the protest happened in Ferguson, all of a sudden this work had a totally different understanding and relationship to it. But I'm interested in how images from then can speak to moments now, and the various ways in which things that we think should never happen again continue to happen, and we continue to let happen, so future generations will look at us the way that we look at them. But also moments where people's willingness to overcome their society's structures kind of changes everything. And so the sculptures that I've been making are really about these moments and about giving myself and viewers a relationship to them, and even thinking about sports as a metaphor for the triumph of the human spirit, which is why people are so attracted to sports, is because it is about like people beating the odds and working together and and going beyond what they think they're capable of. And so work like this celebrates that in a public sculpture that's at City Hall Park. And how am I doing on time? I'm close. Good, because I'm actually am close. Because I kind of want to talk about these last two projects, which are important to me. This one is Question Bridge. It's important to me because it is about all of us, even though it seems to be about some of us. It's called Question Bridge, Black Males. And it talks about how all of us are many people all at once, but we seem to be seen and talked about through very narrow lenses. And so this project called Question Bridge Black Males is a video installation where we went around and asked self-defined African-American men to ask and answer each other's questions. And so and we wound up having like 200 questions and about 1,500 answers. And it really showed that there's as much diversity within any demographic as there is outside of it. This question came from a person who was a guard at the Birmingham, Alabama Museum.
You know, I wonder, black man, are you really ready for freedom? And if not, what will it take for you to want and need this freedom?
So we took that question to someone who was in jail, and we showed him that question on a laptop, and this was his immediate answer.
Am I ready for freedom? And what would it take for me to want that freedom? First, I would have to stop and ask myself, and I would have to go, that's a tough question. Because freedom to me is a mind state, you know, because you got some people that's not in jail that's not free. You know, you got people that's in prison in dysfunctional relationships. You got people that's in prison with jobs, they work 9 to 5 that they don't like. Some people are in prisons with alcohol and drug abuse. So I would have to really ask myself what's in prison in me. And what's been in prison in me is my self-esteem, my lack of self-esteem. My lack of self-esteem has led me to commit crime, to hurt people, to manipulate people, right? Because if I love myself, there's no way I could walk outside this room and punch somebody if I'm esteemed within myself. So to be free to me I would have to change, you know? So in order for me to grow, I'd have to change, because if change is necessary for growth, in order for me to grow, I would have to adapt the mentality that something has got to change in me. I have to change my mind state. I would have to change the way I talk. I have to change the people I interact with. That would be free.
I was there for that. And it just blew my mind that someone in prison or in jail could actually have that level of clarity and have that as his immediate response to what seemed to me like a generic question. The level of nuance and complexity doesn't get summed up into him being a criminal, you know, a menace to society. And I think giving people the opportunity to talk and to share their voices and show their unique perspective is important. So we made that into a 5-channel video installation, an interactive website, questionbridge.com, and a mobile app that continues to collect stories, and even produced a book that was just recently published by Aperture that I hope you all look at, do research, explore, buy, because it's astounding to me, even as an African American male who thinks I know what it means to be a black male, to see the various ways in people present that. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is yet a similar project called The Truth Booth, which it's called In Search of the Truth. And my friends Ryan Alexiev and Jim Ricks and I have been going around the world and the country trying to get people to tell the truth from their perspective. Because again, I'm more interested in hearing what people have to say than I am what I have to say, because each of us has a valuable story to share. And so we took it to Ireland, we took it to Afghanistan, we took it to South Africa, this is from the Cleveland Museum of Art in Miami. We even made it to the presidential debate. But more recently, it's been up in New York, and this is one of the truths that a person shared with us.
The truth is, I've tried to end my life 5 times, and every time I don't succeed, I feel better about myself, and I've overcome it, and I don't wish I was dead anymore, and that's the truth. And I'm happy that I'm a bigger person now.
To me, that was just the fact that she shared that for us was both enlightening and again reminds me that like I can't tell what anyone's going through or what they feel based on looking at the color of their skin or the clothes that they're wearing or the place that they are. And so I just want to close with a few other clips from the Truth Booth.
The truth is not to be discovered because it was there before we were born. It hid itself when we were born, and it only comes out again once we are dead. I'm nearly dead, so the truth will shortly emerge.
I believe the truth is the struggle to find what it really is.
The truth is really small. It's very hard to see, but if you look really, really close, you will find the truth, and it's all around. Thank you.
It is true that I have got a girlfriend that is named Rian, and it is true that my favorite animal is a dolphin, okay? And that's all I wanted to say.
The truth is, Molly, you're a bitch.
The truth is that I want to be an actor, a dancer, a singer, but I'm not sure how to get into the business. I've joined Trading Faces and, well, I've joined the agency of there, but I'm not sure if I'm going to get into I am in the agency, but I'm not sure if I'm going to get anything out of it. And I just really want to be an actress especially, or maybe a beautician, or a singer maybe, or maybe a dancer, but I'm not sure how to get in. That's the truth. This was an Accident Keen production. I want to say hello to Melody, because she's my little doggy, and all my other pets. And my parents. Peace out.
The truth, I believe, is Lego. Lego makes you think small, but believe big. Lego is in all our minds. So the truth is very, very small, but think big. Thank you. Thank you.
I think that kind of sums it all up. The truth is Legos, that even a 10-year-old can see that. The truth is our ability and our willingness to be creative and to express ourselves. Did you want to come up, Damien, and talk to me? And thank you guys for listening. You know, there's a switch on that. I'm fine, thank you. I'll just sit here and sweat. Switch it on.
All right, how's that? I can hear that, okay. So it's a pleasure to share the stage with you, and thanks for that. I thought I would maybe start us off with 2 questions, and then we'll open it up to some of the fine questions that I'm sure are bubbling up in people's consciousness now. You talked there about the South African miners and how you cropped it, raise up that piece, and how the meaning of it changed in the wake of Ferguson with hands up, don't shoot. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Priceless, which now hangs upstairs, and how the meaning of that has changed over the last 10 years, especially as gun violence has become a more salient issue for wider publics. And I want to be careful to note that it's always been a salient issue for some publics, but the level of attention that it's getting now. I just wonder if you have any sort of thoughts about kind of how that piece has changed.
I don't know, but when I think about when I make work that is political in nature, that tries to make a statement, is will I regret it in 10 years or 15 years? And there are things that you can't foresee, like for instance, it being offensive to members of a specific demographic. But that's kind of my marker. I think ads are often used to be relevant for that moment and then discarded. And so I'm always trying to find ways to talk about things that can still have relevance even as the major story around it has changed. So I'm not even sure if the Priceless campaign is still going, but at the same time, it can still. I think it's as potent now as it was then, but I think in different ways.
So I'm actually a Birmingham, Alabama native, and so
Okay.
that clip that you played from Fox News about the reactions sort of stuck in my mind a bit. Jennifer Swinson is one of the people on the street interviews, and they often have descriptions of who these people are, in these person on the street interviews. But her description, what was underneath her name was noticed picture. Now, I actually thought this is kind of an interesting commentary on the contemporary attention economy, right? That actually there's so much competing for our visual attention that noticing a picture becomes almost part of who you are, right? And so it strikes me, though, that there's kind of a tension between involved in appropriating this corporate iconography. On the one hand, it works within the dominant grammar. It gets people's attention. They can understand and unpack things. And I think the Branded series is the most potent example in your work of that kind of recognizability. But I also, in the back of my mind, I think a little bit about Audre Lorde's and master's tools won't take down the master's house. And so, I wonder how you think about that tension in your own work, in terms of developing new vocabularies and new iconographies versus appropriating old iconographies in new ways. I think maybe I'll just stop there.
I mean, I am a big fan of Audre Lorde. I don't entirely agree with that, although I fundamentally agree with it, because English is the master's tool, and she was a writer. Therefore, there are certain tools that we're given that we can't actually find a new way. I struggle with English because when I go to places like South Africa or like Cambodia, or even Peru or France, I realize that the way that I see the world is really, dictated by the language. If we don't have a language for articulating certain things, I hate it when people are like, "Oh, there's not a language for that. There's not a word for that in English." I'm like, "What do you mean there's not a word for that in English? You mean there's some element of human experience or interpretation that I don't have access to because of my language?" And the more of us that actually kind of move into, Anglo-centric identity, the less we have opportunity to see different perspectives of the world.
Right.
But to your question, I wonder if the Unbranded series came out of my realizing that the Branded series was kind of still an advertisement. When we put that piece up outside of the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, we had this kind of bet, because first they were like, "Well, take the logo off, or can you alter the logo?" But I was like, if we alter the logo, that kind of takes away the point of it. And then so they were like, "Well, if we get a cease and desist order, we'll have to take it down." But then it was up for 6 months. It was written about. It was in newspapers, and there was never really any corporate response. And then one of the preparators at the museum pointed out, he's like, "There's of course MasterCard didn't sue us. How else would they were going to get their logo on the front of a major downtown museum?" And so when you think about this idea that I may have been trying to be subversive, but I'm still actually working within the machine, and so I've kind of embraced that in any number of ways. And I think it is, if MasterCard didn't have that currency, I wouldn't have been able to use it to make the statement that I wanted to make. And so I think it's just important that more of us use that currency for our own uses than just having it be about us buying a certain product or validating ourselves about a certain product. So I think with the Unbranded series, where I removed all the logos, which I think is, in my opinion, equally as potent, but I do wonder if that just came out of me not wanting to be making more ads for Nike absolute.
Well, we can open it up here, and I can see most of you, although the lights are a little bright. But do we have questions for?
No, not that I can recall. However, there was one instance where a person asked for a signed copy of it, which I thought was fascinating. He's like, I made this image. Can you send me a print of it? And I was like, okay. Or someone threatened to sue me, and I said, maybe you should, because I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I own it because I bought it, but maybe you own it, and maybe a court would be the perfect place to have this discussion. But then I think with a lot of these images, people really don't want to have a conversation about what the image is about in the first place. So I think there is this kind of real challenge of like, if they sue me, they might make me rich or make me famous, but also make themselves look bad at the same time. So it's really complicated. Why did none of us know who Bert Williams was? I think for a number of reasons. I think one, because there's a cultural shame of like this guy, like blackface is, although it's still popular, and especially on a lot of college campuses, it's something that we have accepted that that is problematic. And most things in American history that we think are problematic, we think it's better to erase them. But it's also not often discussed that because Bert Williams actually, Ben Vereen, who was a performer, who his career, some people argue, tanked because he did a tribute to Bert Williams at Ronald Reagan's nomination at the Republican National Convention. So and people were like, you have a black guy in blackface at a Republican National Convention. You guys don't see the problem with that. But he was trying to make a more subversive statement about kind of this idea of like why a black performer is expected to put on a certain face to be seen. So he was singing "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen," and I think there's this other element of Bert Williams' story is as one of the first black millionaires, he was one of the first black benefactors, which brought about the Harlem Renaissance. And a lot of the times that we'll even see people of our generation that you could argue are known for cooning and minstrelsy. Typically, as they get older, they don't want their children to have to perform those same things, so they give and do new things that aren't necessarily seen as part of their legacy. But I'm more struck by the way he saw himself. That's just crazy, that he's like dapper and like the way that we read him, and that's the power of photography. If you saw that picture, and then you said that even if you said he was a performer, you wouldn't think of him as a performer in that way. Well, as an African American, I feel like I'm an expert. But at the same time, as a human being, I think it's absurd. And the problem is I tend to see myself as an African American before I see myself as a human being, and that's what most people tend to see me as. And the struggle that I have with that, which is why I do projects like Question Bridge and the Truth Booth, is that reminding myself that like the color of my skin is like when I'm looking at you, I don't see the color of my skin, frankly. Like you might see it, but it's not really relevant to me in this moment. And I've had experiences where like to me, it's shocking that people have been having sex for like millions of years, and that somehow we believe that there's like this purity of any ethnicity, that like, where does the line start? Like, so when I think about whiteness, to me, the problem I have with whiteness is, like I said, just 100 years ago, most people who were considered white today would not have been white. And not to mention that a lot of white people were technically black. Even, a lot of black people became white in places like this then. So for all I know, some people who think they're white today, would fall under the category of black, because people passed. And so to me, there's those struggles of like this whiteness. I think of whiteness as this blob. It's like becomes a blob, so you don't have to be actually a person anymore. You don't have to be accountable for things that that's what I thought that was amazing. That woman was like, I'm not black, so I can't be offended because it's, I'm part of the blob, and the blob just consumes everything, and it's not apologetic. But I struggle in moments like that. If a dark brown-skinned person comes in and like punches you, people are going to think I had something to do with it. Like that's what I think is crazy. That like if someone's like they're like a black man did this, how do you feel about it? I'm like, I don't even know that guy. And like there's people in my own family that I don't want to actually have to speak for, much less somebody who just happens to have the same skin complexion like a billion other people. So that's what my struggle is. And so for me to even assume that you're white, because I've had even people who I'm talking to as if they're white, they're like, I'm black, right? I'm like, no, I did not. And that's, blonde hair, blue-eyed black people and so it's really about how you position yourself and then when you go out of the United States, even going to Sweden, there's like, there are black people in Sweden that aren't black. Everyone has their people that are different from us that we make ourselves feel better about ourselves because we're not them. And that can translate in any number of ways. And I find that kind of fascinating that it is another part of the human experience of making ourselves feel better because we're not them. But I believe we are them. And that's the kind of story that I'm trying to like remind myself and remind others. Yeah, I mean, I think ethnicity is a much clearer thing to talk about. Like when you go to Africa, or even South Africa, where I've spent a lot of time, there's like, they have racial categorizations, but then if you look at like a lot of the, like Zulu and Xhosa, there's all these different ways in which people define themselves, and there's very idiosyncratic things about that. Or if you go even to Europe, which is a pretty small place, you can go like in Belgium, you can go 20 minutes and they're like, we are different people from those people who are 20 minutes away from us. Like that's crazy. Like the Flemish versus the French. Like that's how you can. And then, but if those people come here, they're all white. And then it's like, so that's maybe that one, or maybe me. Maybe it's me. Is that? Oh. So anyway, so to me, I think I like to. I can. Not every, then there's people who are multi-ethnic, like our president, who is defined as black, which really doesn't define him physically. I don't agree with the moral definitions of that. Doesn't define him culturally. Like, what is that? If he is black, he became that as an adult, and then the question is why? Because grew up in Hawaii, which is 2% black, raised by all white people, then went from like Occidental to Columbia, to Harvard, to the south side of Chicago. So that's a very circuitous way to get to blackness. Yeah, I mean, there's, I don't know if they're any more a corporate slave than me, frankly. I'm very proud every time I use my American Express card. But why? I do have an American Express card. It's not a black card, therefore I feel like I'm less of a person. But so I really feel like it's important to indict myself along with the other things that I'm critiquing, because but I think every college athlete could say, I wish I was paid. I think it's at least be work study. That they do have a full-time job while they're trying to get an education, which is hard enough for most of us to get an education, much less people who are working all the time. But then with people who, and then even if you are one of that 0.0001% that makes it to become a professional athlete, which is what in basketball, professional basketball, like 50 people a year out of how many people who graduate. Like, and then if you break your ankle or your thumb, there goes your whole life of working towards something. And the industry continues to profit, even like we saw with Ed O'Banion, where there's like EA Sports that, the college NCAA basketball video game, where they actually, you can play a video game that's based off of you, even though you can't profit from it. I mean, I think that's something that everyone knows there's something wrong with, and especially if he's selling cars, to make a living in spite of like never really being able to make any other money from that. And so some people have bought my work. There's been definitely like Jason Kidd and Rasheed Wallace. I had Juwan Howard, who played for Michigan and then the Heat, et cetera, is now a coach. He's the model for that arm piece. And so, but I'm interested in the complex. There's a lot of power in it, like Muhammad Ali being an athlete or Michael Jordan being an athlete. They've done a lot for humanity, not just for quote unquote black people, through their doing simple tasks like putting a ball through a hoop, which isn't harder than raising a child. But them being able to do that really opened many doors. And so I think there is that complexity of like critiquing it, but also recognizing the value of that platform to give us all hope and to transcend the things that limit us.